Alright, so let's talk about the results of the tests. At 4K on Streets Offline, both averaged around 165 FPS, but 64GB held about a 5% advantage in the 1% lows at 137 versus 131, and it was around 3 FPS higher on the 0.1% lows. In 1440, averages were basically the same again at 167 versus 169, but again, the lows leaned towards 64GB, a 2% bump on the 1% lows, and about 6% on the 0.1% lows. Dropping to 1080, the averages were again very close, 175 versus 172, but the gap in the lows was most significant here, 162 versus 155 on the 1%, and 140 versus 125 on the 0.1%. In the online runs, the differences were a little bit more noticeable. In 4K, averages were 145 versus 141, with 64GB showing about a 5% lead in the 1% lows and around 7% stronger 0.1% lows at 88 versus 82. In 1440, the averages were 147 versus 142, with lows about 3 to 6% better on the bigger kit. In 1080, the averages were 149 versus 143, about a 4% difference, and the lows on the 64 were 113 and 93 versus 109 and 87 on the 32GB config. On Customs Offline at 4K, the 64GB setup averaged 198 versus 182 with the 32GB config, almost a 9% increase in average FPS. The lows also improved by about 9 to 10%, keeping 64GB much steadier. In 1440, 64GB averaged 315 versus 302, which is a 4% edge, but the lows were more important, 207 versus 192 and 179 versus 171. Again, about 7 to 8% better consistency. At 1080, it was 322 versus 317, so the averages were basically a wash, but 64GB held slightly higher lows with about a 3 to 4% advantage in both 1% and 0.1% lows. Finally, Customs Online showed the biggest gains for 64GB. At 4K, averages were basically tied, but the 0.1% lows were 14% stronger on 64GB at 114 versus 100. I could definitely feel that difference when I was playing. In 1440, the averages were 211 versus 198, about a 6.5% jump, but the lows are what stood out here again. 153 versus 133 on the 1% and 124 versus 114 on the 0.1% lows. That's about a 10 to 15% smoother experience on 64GB. At 1080, the averages were 212 versus 199, again about a 6% improvement, but the lows were consistently stronger again, 154 and 131 versus 144 and 127.